Welcome to the Signature Books podcast. I'm Devery Anderson, and I am marketing manager at Signature Books. And today, joining me on the program is Dan Vogel, who has just published a new book on Joseph Smith called Charisma Under Pressure, Joseph Smith, American Prophet, 1831 to 1839. And this volume wraps up a 3-volume biography project that Signature Books has had going on for some time. And now that it's out, it's exciting to have it out because this project's done and people can now read in tremendous detail this period of Joseph Smith's life. Now, a little bit about Dan Vogel. He is also the author of another biography of Joseph Smith, published back in 2004, called Joseph Smith, The Making of a Prophet, which covered Joseph Smith's years prior to the Kirtland period. So he continues on with the book under discussion today. And Making of a Prophet was winner of the Mormon History Association's Best Biography Award, and it also won the Best Book Award from the John Whitmer Historical Association. And he's also the author of Book of Abraham Apologetics, A Review and Critique, Indian Origins and the Book of Mormon, and Religious Seekers and the Advent of Mormonism. He's the editor of the 6-volume Wilford Woodruff Journals, the 8-volume History of Joseph Smith and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a source and text critical edition, and of the award-winning 5-volume series Early Mormon Documents. He's also the editor of The Word of God, Essays on Mormon Scripture, and he's co-editor with Brent Lee Metcalf of American Apocrypha, Essays on the Book of Mormon. All right, so as you can see here, Dan has been very prolific in Mormon studies. He's centered on this period of church history, on the period of Joseph Smith's life, and he's been researching him for a long time. So I'm excited to get into this interview and to talk with Dan about his new book. All right, Dan, well, welcome to the podcast. Glad to have you here today.
It's great to be here.
All right, and so the book is Charisma Under Pressure, Joseph Smith, American Prophet, 1831 to 1839. This is part of a multi-volume work that Signature has been working on for some time. This is Joseph Smith's middle years. It's a massive 890-page book, and that's just the text. There's the bibliography and index and introductory material on top of that. So it's a very path-breaking book, I must say. The space allowed here, of course, allows you to go into tremendous detail on the various events of Joseph Smith's life during this period, and having that detail is going to bring out information that really doesn't get talked about, that wasn't known before, and so I can't say enough good about it. It's just
Thank you.
fills a tremendous gap, and I think these volumes in general do that. And with you, you've also written already a biography of Joseph Smith's early life, as well
Yes.
as Richard Van Wagner, so we have kind of your Kirtland book really serves as the middle volume for possibly 2 multi-volume works on Joseph Smith, 3 volumes by you if you do a Nauvoo period, and then 3 volumes with Richard Van Wagner doing one, you doing the middle one, and Marty Bradley doing the third. And I know you've been working on this for some time, and I think 4 or 5 years for the actual book itself. But
Yes.
considering that you've been working on Joseph Smith's life and have dealt with the sources, you put together the history of Joseph Smith and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a multi-volume work there. You and your journey with Joseph Smith really goes back a long, long ways. So we're talking about much longer
Yes.
than just 4 years. So in talking about this particular book, the title, with charisma in the title, Charisma Under Pressure, and the 3 sections that make up the book, all use the word charisma in the title and the titles. So to set the stage, briefly define charisma, the word or the concept as it applies to Joseph Smith.
Yes, well, charisma is pretty well known among scholars of that study institutions and charismatic, what they call charismatic leaders, and it more or less these kind of studies, and they're going pretty hot right now. Actually, when various scholars study institutions and how institution building works and different kinds of leadership. And one of those kinds of leadership is charismatic leadership. And it begins with the work of Max Weber, a German sociologist around the turn of the last century. He wrote on charisma and institution building, or from charisma to institution, because charismatic groups, such as early Christianity, let's say, and early Mormonism, started out charismatically, being inspired by a charismatic leader. And charisma, according to what Max Weber defined it as, is a quality of a person's personality that attracts others to want to follow that person and inspires them into action, whatever project that charismatic leader is promulgating, like a mission, let's say, like Joseph Smith had a mission. And his mission was to establish Zion in Independence, Missouri. Eventually, that's what it became. But from the very beginning, even in the Book of Mormon, it was announced that the New Jerusalem would be established in America somewhere. And that was Joseph Smith's mission. And the book itself, even Max Weber talked about the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith, and he mentioned that Joseph Smith proved his mission by performing the miracle of the Book of Mormon, where he dictated the Book of Mormon in a very short amount of time, and it became the foundation for the movement. So this charismatic quality also is not just one-sided. The person isn't just born with this quality and it just magically works. And in the introduction, I talk about it being uh, socially constructed, that the participants, the followers, supply some of that charisma or the illusion of charisma themselves. I mean, not everybody saw Joseph Smith's charisma, let's say, right? Some people just saw him as an ordinary farmer and weren't very impressed with him. They saw nothing, okay, out of the ordinary. And other people saw him as very charismatic and were drawn to him and would do anything for him. And there's lots of leaders even now. If you look around, you'll see that in operation, in especially in politics. But Max Weber talked about the heroes. There's military leaders that have this quality, politicians, businessmen, and religious leaders. So I hope that's good for an introduction to the word charisma. And the book is kind of built on that principle. So I titled it "Charisma Under Pressure," and the reason why I titled it that was because Joseph Smith was constantly challenged and under pressure, and so it challenged his charisma. And charisma, when it begins, it's very unstable and it's a revolutionary force and can't stay in that state forever, or else it will start to splinter and subdivide into other groups with other charismatic leaders spinning off here and there. And Joseph Smith was met with this right off with other charismatic persons issuing revelations or challenging his revelations, or uh, having challenging his vision of things, and he had to keep getting more revelations, and this can't go on forever. So he slowly starts to build an institution that handles these challenges. So that's part of what the thread that runs through the book is how Joseph Smith deals with these, how he builds an institution, and what forces pressure him to do this and go in that direction. They're natural forces that go in that direction, and they're inevitable. And so the book tries to reconstruct the methods and the strategies he used to respond to the challenges and keep the community together.
All right. And considering that not everyone saw him as charismatic, or and when you talk about it being an illusion to some degree, and I guess what that would mean then, that Joseph Smith would have to live up to what people saw in him. How did his charisma allow him to be successful despite the shortcomings he had? Think of Ezra Booth and his response uh, to Joseph Smith. Just for those like him who would have seen less in Joseph Smith or maybe became disillusioned, um, how did he stay successful despite any shortcomings he had or that others saw that he had?
Yeah, well, it's the shortcomings that kind of do start to make the charismatic illusion a little less, convincing. And so it, as Max Weber described it, it slowly moves to the charisma of office instead of the charisma of that person. And so the transition that starts taking place is a stratification of authority. And also, the publication of Joseph Smith's Revelations helped a lot to uh, provide a rule by which the community is to follow and to be judged. So he set up, the bishop the bishop in the bishop's court to try cases, and eventually that evolved into the High Council that would handle problematic situations so that it didn't really deal with Joseph Smith directly. And so uh, in this process of building the institution, it draws more people in, and they become part of the power structure, and that they are involved in the organization more deeply and less likely to want to go off in their own direction. Um, Another thing was that in the mid 1830s, Joe Smith and Oliver Cowdery started introducing the concept of angelic ordination. So in the early church, the charismatic authority that everybody shared, um, it was easier to splinter off into your own thing until the concept of a chain of authority was introduced, so that it's more difficult to break off because you break the chain, and then how do you claim authority when you've left the organization, and now you don't have that chain of authority anymore. So there's various techniques Joseph Smith uses, and when he does fail, like prophecy fails, like the biggest prophecy that failed was establishing Zion in Missouri. And how does he overcome that? Well, right after the failure of Zion's camp, which would be the failure of charisma, the loss of the Holy Land, there was no immediate hope of ever redeeming Zion and getting Jackson County back from the Gentiles. Um, Joseph Smith came back to Ohio and started organizing more seriously uh, the hierarchy of the church. He founded the 12 Apostles in the 70s and built this institution. He started institution building, which diverted attention from prophecy not being fulfilled. So that's part of what my book covers, is those kind of methods that Joe Smith used to build an institution, to uh, go away from the charismatic origins, to delay the fulfillment of prophecy. At the beginning, everybody thought it was going to be immediately. They were going to establish Zion. They were going to get ready for the second coming. Jesus is coming. And then Joe Smith had to deal with the failure of that, which was a huge, huge crisis in the faith. And how does he handle that? And that's what my book deals with the pressure, charisma under pressure.
It's interesting too that when we talk about the role that the people have who see someone as a charismatic leader, they'll do some of the work for him because, like, especially like later during the apostasy in Kirtland over the bank in that period, um, people will double down, and even no matter what fails or what happens, people tend to just double down if they're following you and they haven't been disillusioned. The only other choice they have is to double down and find a way to still say this worked or was a success or whatever. And I think we saw that with Zion's Camp and in that period in later Kirtland with the bank and all of that. So in talking about some of the specifics of the book, now it's always interesting. Polygamy during the Joseph Smith era is a fascinating subject, and we really see it come to life in Nauvoo. But there's this Fanny Alger incident in Kirtland, which is just kind of off on its own. Which even if people, there's always been the debate: was she a plural wife or was this an affair? And even if you see it as a plural wife, people who hold to that, it's still kind of an odd one because it just kind of is there on its own, and no more polygamy for several years after. So even as a marriage, it's kind of a weird one. But
Yeah.
what is your take on the Fanny Alger incident? Having looked at it in the detail that you have, who was she, or what was his relationship with her?
Well, she was a live-in house servant, and for several years, according to some observers, she was there as a servant with the Smiths in the Smith home. Uh, Beginning about 1834, I would say. No one knows when this affair or celestial marriage or whatever your interpretation is began. We know when it was exposed in public and became a scandal. So I focus on that because that's the more sure part of this story. Um, and it started being exposed by Oliver Cowdery, and uh, mostly because he was there and, according to some accounts, was the mediator between Joseph and Emma. Emma had discovered the affair. She considered it an affair and adultery, and she kicked Fanny out. And Fanny went to this family. She kicked her out in 1836, and she went to live with a family named Webb, and they talk about their knowledge of it later. And so the affair must have gone on for a while, some time. Chauncey Webb thought Fanny was pregnant at the time, but there's really nothing to back that up. But his impression in his mind was that she was pregnant, so that would involve an affair that lasted more than just one time. According to some accounts, Emma had spied on them and saw the transaction. That's the word that was used by William E. McClellan, who interviewed Emma later about things like this, about polygamy. And Emma believed that Joseph Smith lived both polygamy and adultery, and that it was her opinion. And so in this early uh, episode, the beginning, a lot of people named her as a plural wife of Joseph Smith, and that's mostly Eliza R. Snow years later. At the time, Eliza R. Snow didn't know what had happened. She didn't know anything about celestial marriage because when Joseph Smith finally involved her in celestial marriage in Nauvoo, it was a surprise. The whole concept was a surprise to her. So at the time in Ohio, she had no idea of celestial marriage. So she wouldn't know how to handle her knowledge of what was going on with Fanny. And Eliza R. Snow lived with the Smiths at the time as well. And so was what kind of relationship was it is difficult to say. I do not believe Mosiah Hancock's account of his father, that his father had performed the ceremony, and then Mosiah Hancock's late 19th century account is chock full of anachronisms and kind of mimics the knowledge of how plural marriage was dealt with in Utah at the time he's writing this. So I do not give any credit or credence to that account that it was. I think it's kind of a pious fraud on his part. So, what kind of relationship was it? Joe Smith didn't consider it adultery, but Emma and Oliver Cowdery obviously did. Um, so, if there was a ceremony, I say in the book that Joe Smith would have performed the ordinance himself. Somebody tried to say that Oliver Cowdery performed the ordinance, but that is highly unlikely given his subsequent
Right.
attitude about the whole situation. So I don't really think Oliver Cowdery performed it. Who performed it? I don't think anybody performed it. If Joe Smith, if there was a ceremony of some kind, Joe Smith would have done it himself, sort of an auto marriage, speaking the words and then saying "I do" kind of a thing. But I don't really know about that. It could have happened, but then again, I think Joseph Smith at the time had he didn't have a Doctrine and Covenants section 132 concept in his mind. That was in Nauvoo later at the very end of the whole process. But I would imagine that he thought if God gave him a revelation that Fanny belonged to him, and this is what he said to some of the early women also, uh, like um, Eliza Huntington and others, that God had given him a revelation. If they resisted, he would say, God gave me a revelation and you pray about it, kind of a thing. And so he believed that God had given Fanny to him, and that's all he needed. Okay, that was a revelation. That was the authority. That was the command from God to do it. And the command is the authority. So I think that's probably what happened. Fanny subsequently, within months, married a non-Mormon and started having children right away. So she didn't need any formal divorce or anything. So she went right on as if there was no real marriage involved. Um, so I think that's how Joseph Smith probably handled it at the time with Cowdery. He challenged Cowdery. He said Cowdery was saying in Missouri to the members of the church leaders, high councilmen, that Joseph Smith had committed adultery, had a dirty, filthy, nasty scrape or affair, whatever
Right.
was the original word. It's hard to tell which one was the original, but both of them have the same meaning. And meaning it was a scrape, it was a affair, not a sexual, you know, in a sexual context, but in uh, an event context. So that was Cowdery's take, and he was saying those things, and Joe Smith confronted him. And the Missouri church had kind of a hands-off attitude about the whole thing, like these two leaders work it out themselves. And but Joe Smith confronted him and said, "I never confessed to you that I committed adultery, right?" And Cowdery was forced to say, "No, you never confessed to me," because his information came from Emma. And and he was the go-between, and there was no denial by Joseph Smith or anything. So that's how he presented it, and he was very upset by it. Also, as a side light, which I talk about in the book, that Cowdery, if Joseph Smith was tried for this, Cowdery would have become leader of the church too. But he was the second in command at this time. Um, so what Joseph Smith was alluding to when he said that to Cowdery was I never confessed to you. Well, back in Ohio, all the leaders, there was some discord among the leadership of the church in Ohio and over matters, and a lot of it was stemmed from rumors of this or that, and they all took an oath to say that they would never believe anything by rumor or someone else's word. They would always only check with the person that it was about to verify it before they said anything publicly, which Cowdery did not do. And that's what Joe Smith was trying to hold him to. And it was just kind of a manipulation in a way. But Cowdery was quite furious because Joe Smith went back and said that Cowdery confessed that what he was saying was not true. And Cowdery totally denied that. He stood by what he said and his knowledge of the situation. And this is where he writes to a brother and says that, he writes to Joe Smith and says, until you straighten that out publicly and more or less, renew his name and to the other leaders, you and I are two, meaning separate. So that's kind of the origin of the falling out that they had.
Interesting. I In my work on Willard Richards, I know it's interesting when you talk about did Joseph Smith, if there was a ceremony, did he uh, just marry himself to Fanny Alger? Willard Richards did that once in the 1840s with one of the Longstreth sisters. They just in his journal he talks about this is after Joseph's death, and he's talking about polygamy then, and he talks about how they just took each other by the hand and just basically acknowledged that they were husband and wife, but they didn't stay together long. She ended up marrying someone else and married George Watt eventually as a plural wife. But I've often wondered, did he get the idea to do that in his conversations with Joseph Smith? Was that something that had been done before? Are you aware of any other times where people just married each other without
No,
a...
no, and I think I heard you say this before somewhere, but I'm glad you brought it up because I completely forgot about it. Um, the idea came from in the Book of Mormon, where I think it's Alma baptizes himself.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So, yeah, the Holy Ghost comes on Alma, and he has the authority, and then he baptizes. He baptizes auto baptism, baptizes himself. So it sort of came from that. If that's what happened, I don't believe there was an official ceremony performed with Fanny or anything like that. But I don't think Joe Smith considered it adultery uh, in his own mind. He was married to her because I think God gave her to him. And that's the attitude he had with, like I said, those other women in Nauvoo, some of the early polyandrous marriages, even.
Right. So, um, when you say he didn't consider it, you don't think he considered it adultery. Was it like after the fact as a way to justify it,
Oh,
or that beforehand that he saw that somehow God was involved with this before they even...
hmm I'm not sure. It's hard to tell the difference. The evidence would be exactly the same for
Right.
both theories. But uh, polygamy was an issue in the early church right from the beginning. There is some indication that some of the people in Isaac Morley's family believed in changing partners easily. And there were cases trying with that various members for practicing or trying to practice polygamy, spiritual wifery, or whatever they called it. Um, the marriage section of the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants, section 101, it was about mentioned about marriage being performed publicly. They were trying to get authority to perform marriages. They were having a little difficulty with the officials in Ohio getting that authority. So they had to publish uh, a statement publicly that they believed in performing marriages in the open and having the authority to perform marriages. So in that section also mentioned that it denounced the practice of plural marriage because of so-called rumors going about that they believed in plural marriage, and Cowdery is believed to have authored that section, and they had to denounce their belief in plural marriage, that the rumors were false.
Hmm.
So ideas and theories, various theories of how to perform, how to go about doing plural marriage. There's differences between uh, spiritual wifery, concubinage, you know, and polygamy and polyandry. And so it was kind of a fluid situation in early America, and debates about whether polygamy was lawful or not go way back to England, the and the Reformation. That they all debated, these various theologians debated whether polygamy was permitted by God or not. So, but say Joe Smith believed that God sanctioned it. How to go about it was a whole different matter. How do you go about, okay, God says it's okay, but what do you do? How do you do it? And I think Joe Smith struggled with that issue. And we shouldn't confuse Brigham Young's version of plural marriage in Utah with Joseph Smith's version of it.
Okay. Interesting stuff. I know we touched on Zion's Camp a little bit earlier, and the fact that people had to deal with this being kind of a failed mission or a failed prophecy. Zion's Camp, they were able to get how many people went on the camp? Do you know offhand?
205.
So convincing 205 people that you're going to redeem Zion, and then when it didn't happen, I know some later, I think maybe Brigham Young most famously said that what did we accomplish when we was Zion's Camp? Everything we set out to. And people talked about how from Zion's Camp, the earliest apostles, many of them anyway, were chosen, and that to kind of put a positive spin on the whole thing, or to show that it wasn't a total failure. But did that come in like immediately during when this was unfolding and when they didn't accomplish what they had set out for? How do we know how many people were disillusioned by that, and how they had to kind of readjust their thinking to turn it into something that actually was a success at some level?
Uh, well, first of all, Joe Smith wanted like 500 people. He wanted a lot more, an overwhelming force, and he had trouble getting a lot of people. He wanted more money. They barely had enough money to even do this thing, and he had a hard time getting people to donate. Even in the subsequent effort, there was a second day, 1836, September 11th, 1836, after the failure of Zion's Camp. They didn't let it go. They tried to recover from it, and they were going to go again by 1836, September 11th, 1836. And he couldn't get enough recruits and funds even then. So a lot of people were wary of some such grand plans. But the idea, Zion's Camp was considered a complete failure at the time. And Joe Smith really had to work to convince people or to distract them or whatever to keep on going, to stay with the church despite this huge failure. Um, and the whole idea and it's true, a lot of the apostles in 70 came from Zion's Camp, and that makes a lot of sense because these are the people that were probably very disheartened by the whole episode, going, like almost 900 miles for nothing. Um, and he drew them into the hierarchy to make them more invested in the institution. So that was a good move, but it was probably a reluctant move because Joseph Smith enjoyed his special status as the leader. Now he has to share authority, but in some odd way, when you create this pyramid of authority, kind of thing, um, you get more authority. The more people that are underneath sharing this authority, your authority is even greater. But so it kind of works out in Joseph Smith's benefit. But when Zion's camp went and they were suffering from cholera and they were having disputes and arguments, and Joseph Smith is in the middle of some of those difficult arguments and things. They got a really close look at Joseph Smith and his personality and his leadership style. And some would defend him no matter what, and others really said, "Well, that's enough." uh, they they came back, and when they came back to Ohio, Joseph Smith was met in the face and accused of being a dictator, uh, and at the head of all those accusations was Sylvester Smith, and Sylvester Smith that becomes a whole fiasco in itself, where they have a trial. Some people called it a mock trial of Sylvester Smith, trying to blame him for a lot of the problems. He was reluctant to go along with this, but eventually they persuaded him to take the fall, more or less, and come out publicly and say that a lot of the problems were his uh, problems, disputing, and he had accused Joseph Smith of prophesying falsely in the name of the Lord and things like that. And he was the head of the High Council, and he actually survived the whole difficulty. So yeah, Zion's camp was a huge failure. Some people wanted to stay and fight. Actually, they did not believe that if God was on their side, He should help them no matter what. And Joseph Smith was a little more realistic, about this, and called the whole thing off. They were supposed to go and get help from the governor of Missouri, and the governor of Missouri said that they could lead the Mormons that had been exiled from Jackson County and um, restore them to their homes, but they could not stay as a standing army because the governor said that he didn't have authority to do that as a standing army to make sure that they don't get kicked out again. So Zion's camp was supposed to go and provide that uh, support. But by the time they got there, the governor refused to cooperate, and um, they couldn't even get restored. They didn't have enough force to restore the Mormons to their former homes in Jackson County. So, but why didn't Joseph Smith see all this?
Yeah, and that's, I guess, something for depending on where you land on the spectrum. Some people can think they can answer that pretty easily anywhere along the spectrum, but again, it's part of that doubling down, I think, uh, that people kind of train themselves to do uh, when something fails. And I think it's a very interesting one there. The
So,
book,
although there was a lot of apostasy, though, that you mentioned, um, a lot of people stuck with Joseph Smith because they had a lot invested. They got a lot out of the community, so that helped hold people to him.
yeah, yeah, for sure. And that was one of the lows for him, Zion's camp, and there were others. Also, many highs. This middle period of his life, when you think of the New York period, when they're this small sect that moves out of New York, they don't have much. I mean, they had the Book of Mormon, but not much beyond that. And maybe you would answer that differently. But by the time when we see this period in Kirtland and Missouri, they establish so much. They build the temple, which certainly gives the appearance of permanency. I think when you have something like that, and the establishing the printing presses and uh, setting up a newspaper, opening a mission overseas, all these things happen during this period. So, to you, who studied this so well, what would you say is the high for Joseph Smith during this period, and what is the low between 1831 and 1839?
Yeah. Well, I would think the obvious high would have been the Kirtland dedication of the temple, and the weeks preceding that, the endowment, what is called the endowment of power, kind of a Pentecostal period in Mormon history would be probably when Joseph Smith was uh, feeling his most powerful and influential, um, having all sorts of charismatic experiences with the brethren at these priesthood meetings, especially, uh, and the dedication of the temple when it was just throngs of believers there. How can he not feel good? You know. No, well, the low point, of course, is an obvious. Also, I think, would be a 6-month incarceration in Liberty Jail in Clay County, Missouri, and at the last part of this book. Um, that must have been really tough and trying period where a lot of self questioning and maybe doubts, and how does he hold the church together when he's in prison, and how is he going to get out of it? Is he going to get out of it? They tried very hard on uh, using all sorts of methods to get out of there, running out the door, trying to bore holes through the walls of this dungeon, and they finally got a change of venue and escaped in the process. So all of that was harrowing, and I think his writings, though, if you read those sections like 121, 22, 23, a long letter to the church written during his incarceration, and also the letters to Emma during this time, uh, show that kind of you get a glimpse of like resiliency, you know, of not giving up. And they're pretty, those letters written in the Liberty Jail are kind of very poetic, and probably some of his strongest uh, writing. His dictation of it's kind of revelation and prose and poetry mixed all together. It lapses into the voice of deity here and there, and I think it really shows his determination, a belief in his mission. So that's my general position, is what I defend in the introduction of this book, which is a reiteration of some of the stuff I said in my first biography of Joe Smith's, the first part of Joe Smith's life, of what is termed the pious fraud,
Mhm.
meaning he was sincere. He even maybe believed he was a prophet, but that he was commissioned to do whatever necessary to um, promulgate the gospel the best way he knew how. And um, so I see him as believing in his mission, being called, and all of that. But that on occasion he used whatever means necessary to accomplish his mission. He made what he probably thought were tough decisions.
Well, it's interesting when you mention the high of the Kirtland Temple period and the dedication. This came, a few years after Zion's Camp, when, so he was able to turn that around. When you talk about how he strengthened the church hierarchy and created the hierarchy so that people would be, these people would become more invested, and was able to, I guess, turn that around to such an extent that he was able to have this kind of moment in Kirtland with the building of the temple and the dedication of it. Later on, when he sent the first mission overseas to Britain, it was another time, I think, the way Heber C. Kimball characterized it as Joseph Smith telling him that something new must be done for the salvation of the church. And so he sends these uh, first missionaries overseas. Do you feel that that made a big difference for the church? Like, or had he not done that, would there have been greater struggles? I know the influx of the members, to immigrate didn't start until the Nauvoo period, but do you see that this first mission did anything to revitalize things during Kirtland, or was it all? I guess what I'm asking is, did he seem to have some kind of insights as to what needed to happen, and was he right?
Well, he was serious about his mission, about taking the gospel to the world. He was took it to Canada right off, and then in 1837 he sent in missionaries over to England and Britain, and what how there is a marked increase in this effort to do that, and that is in what would be predicted in the crisis situation is that they turn from um, the mission of establishing Zion to kingdom building. And one of the strategies to overcome the failure of prophecy, there's that book, When Prophecy Fails,
Right.
what happens, and there's other. I refer to uh, other scholars' works on what even early Christians did when it seemed like the mission, you know, Jesus's mission had failed. They turn outward and start trying to convince others of their gospel, and they get involved in the work of kingdom building and of gathering people to their cause. And so they get lost in that work and they lose focus of their original mission and the other stuff, the other they put their energies outward instead of inward so much. And so that, like I said, that was predictable that they go to England, and there were people there who were ripe for conversion, let's say, and it worked. They got mass conversions in England, and they started immigrating.
Yeah, and I've looked at a lot of that too. If the biography I've been working on for decades now on Willard Richards.
And the
It's
Brethren, right? The Brethren in England,
the what was it? What were they called? You talk about
United
the
Brethren,
yeah, that all kind of that all
and they were
converted over.
anticipating a restoration.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
they were kind of like looking for new apostles to be sent and a restoration. And so the Mormon message, boom, hit what they
really
were
resonated. Yeah,
expecting, what they were looking for.
yeah, exactly.
That's kind of what I talked about in that one book I wrote many years ago on
On
religious
the
seekers.
yeah. All right, so uh, a lot in this book. The bibliography is, I don't know how many pages, but it's huge and shows all the sources that you consulted for this. And in the last several years, Joe Smith papers have been coming out too, and the final volume of that comes out in just a few days. but did you, doing all this research, did you learn anything in this particular era that this book that you cover in this book that surprised you about Joseph and his either about him or his personality that surprised you?
Oh yeah, just Joseph Smith's personality. Well, I mean, he was human. Sure, the illusion of charisma, the celebrity or whatever you want to say that he had, isn't the real person, of course. And to some extent, if assessments of his character are true, that he did have narcissistic tendencies. I don't say he had narcissistic personality disorder, because that would be like diagnosing the dead, and I don't want to do that. But like all leaders have narcissistic tendencies, then the there will be a problem from for scholars and historians, biographers to ever get at the real Joe Smith. What was the real Joe Smith? And he was too public. He had a public persona way young, so it's very difficult to determine the real Joe Smith. But under pressure would be a one way of trying to find out the real Joseph Smith. And it does turn out he was somewhat of a hothead. That's how I would determine, characterize it. Well, he got in a lot of physical fights. Of course, like Richard Bushman tries to point out, that was quite common back then. And not that it's uncommon now, it seems like, but it was quite common. And Joseph Smith even, got in a physical altercation with his brother-in-law, you know, and there was a trial, but the brother-in-law somehow didn't show up, and Joseph Smith wasn't prosecuted in that matter. But um, and on Zion's camp, there was a couple of episodes there where he seemed to lose his cool. He didn't like to be challenged. Um, it's sort of like he was the leader. He was going to be the leader no matter what. And when he went to Missouri in 1831 for his first trip, he got in an altercation with Bishop Partridge. And Ezra Booth wrote a letter that later that same year to Edward Partridge and reminded him of Joseph Smith, and said that he didn't have the qualities that you would expect from a religious leader anyway, and that he was so angry that with Bishop Partridge, because Bishop Partridge had questioned the land that Joe Smith chose for the temple site. It said wasn't that great of quality. And Joe Smith went into a rage. And Ezra Booth described that as that he got so angry that it bordered on madness. And so it was quite the display in front of his followers, who were trying to be all religious, and they calling themselves saints, you know. And um, so there is that temperament that should be considered. That yeah, he didn't like being contradicted, which creates a lot of motivation to be the leader when you are demanding to be the leader, to stay the leader, and that you will do whatever necessary to stay in that position. Uh, but he had, he, I believe he thought himself, he knew he wasn't perfect. He says, I'm not religious. I'm not very righteous. I mean, he says, I'm not very righteous. He confessed. I mean, his confessions are in some of his revelations when he's getting chewed out by God and stuff. I believe that's all sincere. Um, and that's probably one of the qualities that attracted him to other people, because he was that's the thing about uh, narcissism attracts people, because narcissists don't really, they are so self-confident. But he didn't hide these facts. He needed to show them in order to get over uh, some bumps, and he did what he had to do, and he got over them and kept people following him. And so he's very determined. He believes in his mission. He believes he is inspired. But the point is, at the bottom line is that he did manipulate people. Um, and he made a lot of bad choices as a leader. Of course, he had leadership qualities. People followed him. He demanded to be followed, but he made a lot of bad decisions, and in a lot of ways, he was in over his head, and he was learning as he was going, um, and faking it somewhat. And I think one of his biggest mistakes was to choose a specific spot to build a temple where people already lived and expected to succeed in that situation, and that he would be able to overcome anything that the inhabitants of that place that he wanted would put out to stop him. And they won, actually, in the end, because we have to face it. The bottom line is, he made a mistake. He goofed. His leadership faltered at times, and some of his followers saw that. His so his Zion project was doomed from the beginning. His bank project was doomed from the beginning. Um, but yet he still had the qualities that attracted and kept people, no matter what mistakes he made. They still believed in him. And that's what I find is the lesson that he learned as a treasure seeker. And as a treasure seeker, he never found any treasures, but he had all
Right.
these people still believing in that he had that gift. He even had the money diggers in his neighborhood that he was accompanying with believing that he actually had the plates. Okay. They wanted to tear down his house, whatever, to get to the plates, because he was that convincing. He was that convincing. Um, and that is his talent. That's his talent. He got people to do things they wouldn't do otherwise for anyone else.
All right. Yeah. Good stuff. All right. I want to talk a little bit about the Missouri period, because that's when we ever the word persecution is used to talk about the early Mormon experience. It's usually in reference to Missouri. That period in before 1833, 1834, when the situation in Independence, when they were driven out of there, and hence the formation of Zion's Camp. And then later on, during the Far West period, when things erupt again. At that point, Joseph Smith's living in Missouri. He didn't live there until 1838, with it, when he when they founded Far West, and he left Kirtland and moved there. And then, of course, they have a disastrous experience there. And people have talked about the church and persecution a lot over the years. And how much blame do you see the church as having been persecuted? Do you see that they brought a lot of this on themselves? Do you see them as victims? Do you see a little bit of both? How would you describe the church in Missouri, and the church and persecution?
Well, I would say it's a little bit of both. Um, like I said, to expect to go into someone's community and bring in a bunch of uh, followers and take over a community politically and economically and not expect anyone to fight back. Um, it's a little unrealistic. And uh, when you start at the very beginning, when the Mormons first came into that little village of Independence, Missouri, and then they tried to go over and, meddle with the Indians and making people feel a little nervous. Um, and then people start migrating and accumulating and taking over the town. And not only are they taking it over, they're telling the people there they're reading the Book of Mormon and the revelations to these people. They're even publishing them and saying that they're going to Independence, Missouri is this center spot, and that God has given it to them, and they might as well either convert or get out because it's going to be a holy city just for believers, Uh, and then they read prophecies out of the Book of Mormon about believing Gentiles uniting with Indians, Native Americans, or Lamanites in the Book of Mormon. Um, and the Lamanites will more or less take back their inheritance, by force. And you're out there on the frontier trying to make it and establish farms and inheritance for your children and so on. And then you have a group kind of that are clannish and stick together and have these weird beliefs, and they're very kind of aggressive in their militant in their stance. Um, to expect nobody's going to do anything in one way or another, especially when there's no police force, there's nothing out there, there's nothing to help you. To expect nothing to happen is a little unrealistic, and to act all surprised at why you're getting persecuted is a little naive, So I think in a certain way, and Joseph Smith back in Ohio wrote to his own followers and say, "Don't talk about this stuff. you know, Keep it to yourself. Don't mention any of this stuff." Um, yeah, that was a mistake, but the mistake is not easily withdrawn. And I think how in July 1833 is when the press was destroyed in Independence, Missouri. The Evening and Morning Star Press, W. W. Phelps as the editor, that was destroyed, and Bishop Partridge was tarred and feathered with another member, uh, and that was, and it wasn't mobs; it was organized. Um, it was an organized committee that wrote up a constitution and made demands of the Mormons, and they were trying to more or less tell them that they need to get out. They need to choose another place, maybe where nobody is. And uh, so it wasn't just a mob going and tearing it down. It was all organized effort to give a message to the Mormons because they weren't getting the message. But the Mormons were tied to that area by revelation, and they couldn't easily just abandon the area. That was the mistake by revelation appointing an exact spot. Um, that was the unraveling of Joseph Smith's revelations right there. But um, so the Mormons were tied to the area. The people did not want to go. They organized an effort to get rid of the Mormons, and not realizing how hard the Mormons would have it to leave that area. So they're kind of at loggerheads with each other. But the non-Mormons won out eventually, and the Mormons got kicked out. But I think W. Phelps's article, "Free People of Color," is what um, triggered them. That Mormons threatened to bring in free blacks into a county where there were slave owners, and the slave owners couldn't tolerate free blacks running around free with their
Right.
enslaved blacks watching this. It just was not a working situation. And I think Phelps, of course, there weren't a lot of black people in the church that were going to migrate there in the first place. So, why did Phelps publish that essay? That article. And I think he was trying to scare off the Missourians, saying, "Well, we're going to bring a bunch of free blacks into this area, and you won't like it, so you might as well just leave." Well, I think that was a bluff. I think that was a ploy to try to get the non-Mormons out, and it backfired. So that's just the beginning in 1833, and then finally they went to uh, Clay County, and those people said, "Well, your time's up here. We want you to move off." So they organized Caldwell County just for the Mormons. The idea was the Mormons would go there and be left alone. They would have their own land finally, but but they couldn't just stay in Caldwell County. They wanted Daviess County to the north also, and they kept going there. And those people got upset, thought the Mormons hadn't followed the plan, and they started trying to kick the Mormons out of Daviess County, and the Mormons resisted. And that attracted, when Joseph Smith finally arrived, that attracted Joseph Smith's leadership. And he and a lot of armed Mormons went up to Daviess County, and they threatened one of the judges, Adam Black, and they even started, going around burning some of these major anti-Mormon towns as they saw it, and looting houses and a store, and carrying the goods back to Adam-on-Diamond. And this is where I think Joseph Smith's leadership again failed, where he got impatient, especially in 1838, July 4th, Senior Rigdon's, you know, sermon for the 4th of July, saying that, we will not tolerate any, mobbing anymore, and it'd be a war of extermination if you ever try to attack us. And so Senior Rigdon was the first to use that war of extermination phrase. And
Yeah.
they even published that pamphlet. They weren't like afraid of it or anything. Joe Smith sanctioned it. And that stance, that militant stance, is what did him in. I mean, you're going to go against the whole state. That's a totally unrealistic. But that's Joseph. We should judge Joseph Smith's leadership by this. He had problems that he needed to be held accountable for, but never was, for these kinds of bad decisions.
We talked a little bit about just some of the things that he accomplished in Nauvoo, or in the Kirtland era, with the overseas mission, and just establishing the temple and all of that, which that alone would I suppose, create some evolution in the person himself, just because his leadership, he's now over more people than he had been before. And I suppose when you evolve from a small sect to an established church, whoever is looked at as the leader is going to be perceived differently, and hence that person will perceive themselves differently as well. But since you've published two books on Joseph Smith, two biographies so far, and you've done tremendous research into his whole life, do you see an evolution of, when you think of the New York Joseph Smith as opposed to Kirtland, Missouri era? Do you see an evolution in him, which, like I say, is some of it was inevitable if the organization you founded grows and you become a leader to more people, and more people are looking at your leadership or gushing over you or any number of things, that's going to create some of that. But how would you respond to that? Did Joseph Smith, do you see an evolution in him from between New York and Kirtland and Missouri?
Well, so in New York, he's basically a kid, you know, very young and idealistic is how I describe him. Idealistic. He has these ideal ambitions. He's kind of a purist of thing, in concepts, and his followers were spread out. He had no political power that he got in Ohio and Missouri by being concentrated with a concentrated population that followed him, created political power for him. But basically, the overview I see as Joe Smith was young and ambitious and idealistic, and reality was setting in with his ideas expressed in the Book of Mormon and the New Jerusalem and government, patriarchal government that he wanted to set up in Missouri. He didn't always let go that easily. Probably in Nauvoo is where he finally changed the whole tone of what he wanted, and kind of gave up on the idealistic. I mean, there's no way he's going to get back to Missouri with a bunch of followers. There was maybe a scheme afloat when he wanted to be a general in the armies watching the Indians in the Western territories. That might have been a one scheme he was thinking of, but uh, for the most part, he started redefining Zion and talking about Zion's and the stakes of Zion and gathering to the stakes for safety, and so he kind of gave up on that Independence Missouri uh, goal, no, at least not for the near term, and and became more vested in actual, real, uh, you know, government and leader, and trying to be a leader that way, but uh, not in some scheme of setting up the New Jerusalem over and uniting with the Indians and maybe going through and purifying the American government from the secret combination that took it over, which was Andrew Jackson when the Book of Mormon was dictated, um, which Jackson was out of office by, and the world didn't come to an end, you know, with Jackson in office, like a lot of people believed at the time. It was a very, heady time, I imagine, where they thought Jackson just became president. He's a leader of this secret combination, and uh, that the government has been infiltrated. That was like the Masonry was the deep state theory of that time, you know, and um, and it had a hold of a significant amount of Americans, uh, but probably the majority. It was one of those loony kind of conspiracy theories to the rest of the country. In Western New York, it was the hottest rage. At the time the Book of Mormon came forth, and Joseph Smith rode that wave until it ended, really, naturally. And he just kind of tried to retool his thing to keep going, and put his energies into more realistic ventures like building the church. And, I think he grew up a lot, on the job, you know?
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, so, yeah, I think the idealism, trying to not deny the past, but yet kind of move on. You don't hear him talking about secret combinations after a certain period of time. I mean, it's brought up in association, used as like a label to put on people that were thieves, in the Nauvoo area. He would put that label on them as a pejorative term, you know, but he had no, the government's being taken over by a secret combination idea, and I need to fight the secret combinations. We need to flee to Missouri to flee the secret combinations, None of that. That just all disappeared. That rhetoric all disappeared. Um, so I think, yeah, we've seen the maturing of Joseph Smith, you know, on the job, like I said, uh, trying to make it, uh, trying to reinvent himself to be relevant, to his followers. We see that.
All right. Well, great insights there. And we're out of time. So I want to thank you,
Okay.
Dan, for joining me today. Again, the book is Charisma Under Pressure, Joseph Smith, American Prophet, 1831 to 1839. This covers in tremendous path-breaking detail his middle years during the Kirtland, Ohio sojourn, as well as the Missouri period that occurred simultaneously with much of the Kirtland era. And this is a tremendous book. I think it's going to be the standard for forever, at least for decades to come. And anyone dealing with Joseph Smith going forward has to really deal with this as well as the other volumes that you've done, and look forward to more from you. Hopefully, we'll see a Nauvoo period covered down the road,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
look forward to that one too. So thanks a lot again for coming on today with me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Devery.